June 15th, 2021, 5:30 in the afternoon. A 5-year-old girl with blonde hair and bright blue eyes walks across a dirty yard in rural Tennessee. Her hands are dirty from planting flowers. She smells like summer sweat and soil. Her grandmother has just given her a piece of candy. She walks toward her house, toward her 3 brothers watching videos at the kitchen table. Her mother watches from 20 feet away as the little girl opens the kitchen door and steps inside. 2 minutes later, she is gone. Not missing, not lost somewhere on the property. Gone, vanished from a house where 4 other people were present. Disappeared in the time it takes to adjust a knee brace. Her name is Summer Moon Utah Wills. And 4 years later, no one knows what happened in those 2 minutes. This is the story of one of Tennessee's longest-running Amber Alert investigations. A case that has consumed more than 6,500 tips, searched over 3,000 acres of treacherous mountain terrain, and mobilized more than 100 law enforcement agencies. A case with no arrests, no suspects, no conclusive evidence. A case the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation admits is outside the norm. Tonight we examine what investigators know, what they don't know, and why, after 4 years, a little girl's disappearance from her own home remains one of the most baffling missing child cases in modern American history. Summer Moon Utah Wells was born on February 4, 2016, in Hawkins County, Tennessee. By the time she turned 5, she was living with her parents, Don Wells and Candace Bly, and her 3 older brothers in the remote Beach Creek community near Rogersville. The family's home sat on Ben Hill Road, a winding rural route in the 100 block deep in the mountains of northeast Tennessee. This is isolated country, dense forest canopy, steep inclines that make walking treacherous, spotty cell phone reception, the kind of place where neighbors are separated by acres of woodland, where wildlife outnumbers people, and where a child could disappear into the landscape and never be found. By all accounts, Summer was a happy little girl. Blonde hair that caught the light, blue eyes that sparkled with mischief. At 3,000 tall and roughly 40 pounds, she was petite for her age. She loved playing outside. She loved her brothers. And on that June day, she loved helping her mother plant flowers. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in rural Tennessee, until it wasn't. According to Candace Bly's account to investigators, an account she has maintained consistently for 4 years, June 15th began like many summer days at the Wells home. That afternoon, Summer was outside with her mother and her maternal grandmother. The 3 of them were planting flowers together in pots near a camper that sat approximately 20 feet from the main house. Summer was excited about the flowers. She was chatting, laughing, doing what 5-year-olds do on warm afternoons when they're given a task that makes them feel helpful and grown up. The time was around 5:30 to 6 in the evening. After finishing with the flowers, the group went inside to wash their hands. Summer's grandmother gave her a piece of candy, a small reward for being a good helper. Summer accepted the candy, and then she asked her mother if she could go see her brothers. Her 3 brothers were inside the house, gathered around the kitchen table, watching YouTube videos together. Candace said yes. She walked Summer partway across the yard, roughly halfway between the camper and the house. From there, she could see the kitchen door clearly. She watched as Summer walked the remaining distance, pulled open the kitchen door, and stepped inside. Before returning to help her mother with a knee brace in the camper, Candace called out to her sons. "Watch Summer." The boys acknowledged her. Summer was now in the house with her brothers. Her mother could see the house from the camper doorway. Everything seemed normal. Approximately 2 minutes passed. 2 minutes, 120 seconds. The time it takes to walk across a room. The time it takes to help someone adjust a medical brace. The time it takes to glance away from your children and assume they're safe. When Candace returned to check on Summer, she found her 3 sons still at the kitchen table. "Where's Summer?" she asked. Her sons looked up from their videos. "She went downstairs," they said, "to the basement." The Wells home had a basement playroom where the children often played. Candace called down the stairs. "Summer. Summer, baby, come here." No response. Candace called again, louder this time with the edge of concern creeping into her voice. "Summer." Nothing. This was unusual. As Candace would later tell investigators, "She always answers me." Summer was an obedient child. When her mother called, Summer responded. The basement door stood open. It was typically unlocked, a family home where children ran freely between floors. Candace descended into the basement. The playroom was empty. She searched the basement thoroughly. She searched the ground floor. She went back outside and searched the area around the camper, around the flower pots they'd just been working with, around the outbuildings on the property. She called Summer's name over and over, her voice growing more frantic with each unanswered cry. Summer was nowhere. At approximately 6:30 p.m., Candace Bly called the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office to report her daughter missing. Emergency scanner audio from that evening captured the initial dispatch. The parents have called in, advised that the mother had went for a walk, came home, and now they can't find her. There's a detail in that dispatch audio worth noting. The initial report stated the mother had went for a walk and came home to find Summer missing. But according to Candace's detailed account to investigators, she never left the property. She could see the house from the camper doorway the entire time. This discrepancy in the very first report would become one of many small inconsistencies that would fuel speculation and suspicion in the months and years to come. But in that moment, on that June evening, there was no time for questions about timelines or statements. There was only the immediate, desperate reality. A 5-year-old girl was missing. Don Wells, Summer's father, was at work when his wife called him in a panic. He raced home, his mind spinning through possibilities, each one worse than the last. When he arrived at Ben Hill Road, emergency responders were already beginning to mobilize. The massive search for Summer Wells was about to begin. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation issued an endangered child alert that very evening, June 15th, within hours of the initial report. This is standard protocol for missing children, but it indicated that investigators were taking the disappearance seriously from the start. By the next day, June 16th, that alert was upgraded to a statewide Amber Alert. TBI spokesperson Leslie Hayhart explained the escalation. The upgrade came due to new information and growing concern about Summer's well-being. What was that new information? The TBI has never publicly specified, but the rapid escalation from Endangered Child Alert to Amber Alert suggested investigators believed Summer's disappearance was not simply a case of a child wandering off. An Amber Alert is reserved for cases where law enforcement believes a child has been abducted and is in imminent danger. The criteria are specific. There must be reason to believe the child's life is at risk. There must be sufficient descriptive information to believe the alert will help. The child must be 17 or younger. Summer Wells met all the criteria. The alert broadcast across Tennessee. A 5-year-old girl, 3 feet tall, 40 pounds, blonde hair, blue eyes, last seen wearing a pink shirt and gray shorts, possibly barefoot, missing from Hawkins County. The description went out to every law enforcement agency in the state. It appeared on highway signs. It flooded social media. Local news stations interrupted regular programming. And the question everyone was asking, how does a 5-year-old girl vanish from her own home in broad daylight with multiple family members present? Within days, federal resources arrived in Hawkins County. The FBI's Child Abduction Rapid Deployment Team, known as CARD, descended on the rural community. These are the Bureau's elite specialists in child abduction cases. They bring expertise in victimology, behavioral analysis, investigative strategy, and forensic resources that local agencies often lack. The presence of the FBI CARD team sent a clear message. This case was a priority. The full weight of federal law enforcement was now focused on finding Summer Wells. But finding a missing child in the mountains of northeast Tennessee is not like searching an urban neighborhood with surveillance cameras on every corner and witnesses on every block. This is challenging terrain in the truest sense. The area surrounding the Wells property is dense with vegetation. Steep hills make foot travel exhausting and dangerous. Creek beds cut through the landscape, some barely visible under thick brush. Wild animals, including black bears and coyotes, roam freely. And in June, the forest canopy is at its thickest, blocking aerial views and creating countless pockets where a small person could be hidden or trapped. If Summer had wandered off, the terrain could have concealed her within minutes. If someone had taken her, the isolation of the property meant there were no witnesses, no traffic cameras, and no way to track which direction a vehicle might have gone. The search began immediately, and it would become one of the most extensive missing child searches in Tennessee history. For 13 days straight, the area surrounding the Wells property became the site of an extraordinary mobilization of resources and personnel. The numbers alone tell the story of the effort. 1,150 ground searchers logged 13,800 hours across 3,000 acres of mountainous terrain. That's 4.6 square miles, an area roughly the size of 2,700 football fields, covered on foot, step by step, in summer heat, through dense brush and steep inclines. 120 agencies participated, not just from Tennessee, but from Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Ohio. Sheriff's departments, state police, fire departments, rescue squads, volunteer search and rescue teams. Everyone who could help, helped. 21.2 hours of TBI fixed-wing aircraft surveillance. 30 hours of Tennessee Highway Patrol helicopter searches, eyes in the sky, scanning the forest canopy for any sign of flash of pink fabric, a disturbance in the vegetation, anything that might indicate where a small girl had gone. Dive teams searched every pond, creek, and body of water in the Beach Creek area. This was the search no one wanted to conduct, but everyone knew was necessary. If Summer had fallen into water, time was critical. Multiple canine units deployed specialized tracking dogs. These dogs are trained to follow scent trails to distinguish between human and animal tracks, to locate remains even days after death. One of those dogs picked up Summer's scent. The dog tracked from the house to the road. This was potentially significant. If Summer's scent led to the road, it suggested she had left the property. And if a 5-year-old had reached the road alone, there were only a few possibilities. She had walked along the road and was somewhere further away. She had been injured or disoriented and was somewhere nearby, or someone in a vehicle had picked her up, willingly or unwillingly. But a scent trail is not conclusive evidence. Dogs can be wrong. Scent can be misleading, especially in outdoor environments with wind and weather. And no other evidence corroborated the dog's alert. Still, it was something. In a case with almost no physical evidence, it was one of the few concrete leads investigators had. The search expanded beyond the immediate property. Teams combed through neighboring properties with the owner's permission. They searched abandoned structures. They checked wells and cisterns. They examined every place a child could hide, fall, or be hidden. The Wells property itself underwent the most intense scrutiny. TBI agents executed multiple search warrants, more than 11 documented searches of the property over the course of the investigation. They searched the main house room by room. They searched the basement where Summer had allegedly gone. They searched the camper where Candace and her mother had been working. They examined every vehicle on the property. They searched outbuildings, sheds, storage areas. They even searched barrels, every container large enough to conceal a child. They searched the crawl space under the house. They brought in cadaver dogs. They photographed everything. They collected digital evidence, cell phones, computers, tablets, any device that might contain relevant information. They pulled phone records. They examined social media accounts. If there was evidence that Summer had been harmed in that house, investigators were determined to find it. But they found nothing conclusive. No blood evidence, no signs of violence, no body, no clothing, no physical evidence that indicated what had happened to Summer Wells in those 2 minutes between the kitchen door and her mother's return. By June 28th, 13 days after Summer disappeared, the massive ground search was scaled back. Not because investigators were giving up, but because they had exhausted the immediate possibilities. 3,000 acres had been searched. Every viable lead had been followed. Every piece of property had been examined. Summer was simply gone. TBI spokesperson Leslie Hayhart addressed the media as the active search wound down. There are few clues as to what happened to Summer, despite investigators doing everything within their power to find answers. She added something that would become the defining statement of this case. We've said from the beginning, this case is outside the norm. Outside the norm. In law enforcement parlance, that's a significant admission. It means this case doesn't follow the typical patterns. It means the usual investigative approaches aren't yielding results. It means something about Summer's disappearance is anomalous, inexplicable, stubbornly resistant to standard methodology. But what makes a missing child case outside the norm? Usually there's evidence, physical evidence, clothing, belongings, signs of a struggle. Or there's a witness, someone who saw something, heard something, noticed something unusual. Or there's a clear timeline that helps investigators narrow possibilities. In Summer's case, there was none of that. Just a 2-minute window and an empty house. In any missing child case, investigators must examine the people closest to the child first. Statistics are brutally clear. When a child is harmed, it's most often by someone in the family or close to the family. Strangers abducting children from their homes, rare. family involvement is not. So, from the very beginning, Don Wells and Candace Bly were under intense scrutiny. This is standard investigative practice. It's not prejudice or assumption. It's statistical reality and proper procedure. But for parents who insist they had nothing to do with their child's disappearance, being treated as potential suspects is devastating. The Wells family became the focus of intense public interest, media coverage, and perhaps most damaging, social media speculation. Sheriff Ronnie Lawson of Hawkins County was direct about the investigative approach. Everybody is still a suspect, person of interest, however you want to put it. That statement would be repeated in interview after interview, year after year. Nobody was ruled out. The parents were not cleared, but neither were they arrested. This liminal space, not cleared but not charged, became the defining characteristic of Don and Candace's relationship with the investigation. Both Don Wells and Candace Bly agreed to sit for polygraph examinations. These tests were administered with FBI oversight, meaning experienced federal polygrapher examiners were involved. According to Sheriff Lawson, both parents passed their polygraphs. Now, polygraph results are not admissible in court for good reason. They're not 100% accurate. People can pass polygraphs while lying. People can fail polygraphs while telling the truth. The tests measure physiological responses to stress, not truth itself. But in investigative terms, polygraph results matter. They help investigators prioritize leads and focus resources. When parents pass polygraphs in a missing child case, it doesn't clear them definitively, but it does suggest they're likely telling the truth as they know it. Both Dawn and Candace passed, and yet, Sheriff Lawson maintained, everyone remains a person of interest. The tension between past polygraphs and still persons of interest encapsulates the frustration of this case. There's no evidence to charge the parents. There's also no evidence to completely rule them out. The TBI has never named any suspects. They have never named any persons of interest officially. For 4 years, the investigation has proceeded without publicly identifying anyone as being under particular suspicion. This absence of a clear investigative focus has created a vacuum, one that has been filled by speculation, rumor, and amateur internet sleuths convinced they can solve the case from their keyboards. But before we delve into the circus of social media theories, we need to understand who Don Wells and Candace Bly are. Because their backgrounds, their history, and their decisions have all become part of the narrative around Summer's disappearance. Don Wells is a 54-year-old man who has lived most of his life in rural Tennessee and Utah. He works in construction and landscaping, hard physical labor that requires moving from job to job. He's described by some who know him as a hard-working provider. Others describe him differently. Don has a criminal history. This is not speculation. It's documented in court records. In the 1990s, while living in Utah, Don was convicted of multiple felonies: theft, burglary, and forgery. These are serious crimes, and they paint a picture of a young man who made significant mistakes. But those convictions are old. Don served his time. He moved to Tennessee, started a family, and by his account, tried to build a different life. More recent is an arrest in October of 2020. Just months before Summer disappeared, Dawn was arrested for domestic assault, possession of a handgun while intoxicated, and unlawful weapon possession. The incident involved an altercation with Candace. Neighbors called police. When officers arrived, Don was intoxicated and armed. He was charged. But here's where the story gets complicated. Don pleaded guilty only to the handgun charge in April of 2021, 2 months before Summer vanished. The other charges, including domestic assault, were dismissed. We don't know the full details of why charges were dismissed. It could have been a plea deal. It could have been insufficient evidence. It could have been Candace declining to cooperate with prosecution, which is common in domestic cases. But the fact remains, Don Wells had a recent arrest for domestic violence and weapons charges shortly before his daughter disappeared. Does that mean he harmed Summer? No. Millions of people with criminal records are loving parents. But it does mean investigators had to look closely at the family dynamic. Then, in October of 2021, 4 months after Summer vanished, Dawn was arrested again, this time for DUI. His blood alcohol level was 0.13%, well above the legal limit. The arrest violated his probation from the previous handgun charge. Don served 180 days in Hawkins County Jail in early 2022. 6 months behind bars while his daughter was missing. When he was released, he told reporters he couldn't find work in Tennessee. People recognized him. They harassed him. He described strangers showing up at job sites screaming accusations. He said someone yelled, "Baby killer," at Candace in a public place. The family eventually moved to Arkansas. In interviews, Don Wells comes across as emotional, defensive, and steadfast in his belief that Summer was abducted. He has repeated the same core narrative for 4 years. He believes someone took his daughter through the wooded area behind the house to a waiting vehicle. "We know that she was taken off our property," he told media outlets. "We know that she was taken away in a vehicle, or they would have found her in the area." That statement, we know, is significant. Don speaks with certainty about what happened, even though there's no evidence to support his theory. Investigators don't know Summer was taken off the property. They don't know she was taken in a vehicle. Don believes these things, but belief is not evidence. On the 4th anniversary of Summer's disappearance in June of 2025, Don spoke to reporters again. His words were haunting. "I expect to see her eventually. I don't know about in this life." That statement could be interpreted 2 ways. It could be the words of a grieving father who has accepted his daughter is likely dead and hopes for reunion in an afterlife. Or it could be read more darkly as an admission that he knows Summer is dead. Context matters, tone matters, and without hearing Don speak those words, it's impossible to know which interpretation is correct. Candace Bly is 45 years old. She is Summer's mother, and she is the last person known to have seen Summer alive, apart from Summer's 3 brothers. Her account of June 15th is detailed and has remained consistent. They were planting flowers. She walked Summer partway to the house. She watched her go inside. She returned to help her mother with a knee brace. 2 minutes later, Summer was gone. Candace has a minor criminal record from 2003, a misdemeanor, domestic abuse, and disorderly conduct charge from Wisconsin. That's 22 years old and relatively minor. But her behavior since Summer's disappearance has drawn scrutiny and criticism. Candace has given multiple interviews to media outlets and YouTubers. Some of these interviews have been sympathetic, others have been openly hostile. In all of them, Candace appears emotional, sometimes confused, sometimes contradictory. Critics point to small inconsistencies in her statements. Supporters argue she's a traumatized mother who is being re-traumatized by constant interrogation. In November of 2021, 5 months after Summer vanished, Don and Candace appeared on Dr. Phil's television show. This was their highest profile media appearance. Dr. Phil brought in body language experts to observe Don and Candace during interviews. The format was intense. At one point, Candace became so upset she walked off the set crying that she felt interrogated again. Dr. Phil himself concluded at the end of the episode, "It's clear to me that neither of you did anything to hurt your daughter." This was a significant statement from someone who has interviewed countless parents in missing child cases. Dr. Phil was convinced of their innocence regarding direct harm, but he added something else. He suggested that Candace may know more than she consciously realizes. He predicted, "When this is solved, this isn't going to be a stranger." What did he mean by that? Was he suggesting someone known to the family was responsible? Was he implying that Candace had witnessed something she didn't understand or has repressed? Or was he simply covering all possibilities? We don't know, but his words have fueled continued speculation that the answer to Summer's disappearance lies within the family's circle, not with a random abductor. Candace has largely withdrawn from public view in recent years. She declined interview requests in 2025, telling one reporter she still has nightmares and anxiety related to Summer's disappearance. That could be the behavior of a guilty person avoiding scrutiny, or it could be the behavior of a trauma victim who has been harassed and accused for 4 years straight. We simply don't know. Summer had 3 older brothers. Their names and identities have been protected by media outlets, and we will continue that protection here. On June 15th, those 3 boys were at the kitchen table watching YouTube videos when their mother told them to watch Summer. They saw Summer enter the house. They saw her walk past them. They said she went downstairs to the basement. The boys were interviewed by investigators multiple times. What they said in those interviews has never been made public, and rightly so. Children are vulnerable witnesses. Their memories can be unreliable, especially under stress, and they deserve protection from public scrutiny. But we know this. The boys' accounts apparently did not provide investigators with clear evidence of what happened to Summer. In July of 2021, 1 month after Summer disappeared, the Tennessee Department of Children's Services removed the 3 boys from Dawn and Candace's custody. This is an extraordinary intervention. DCS does not remove children lightly. There must be evidence of abuse, neglect, or dangerous living conditions. There must be a court order. The boys were placed in foster care or with relatives. The specific details have not been made public. For 3 years, Dawn and Candace fought to regain custody of their sons. For 3 years, the boys remained in state care. Then, in 2024, Dawn and Candace signed over their parental rights. They relinquished custody permanently. Dawn told media, "We didn't have a choice." That statement raises questions. What did "didn't have a choice" mean? Were they threatened with in any way? Did they believe they couldn't win in court? Did they think the boys would be better off elsewhere? We don't know the full story. Juvenile and dependency court records are sealed, for good reason, to protect the children involved. But here's an interesting development. In June of 2025, Dawn announced publicly that the DCS case had been dismissed. He shared court documents showing all opinions of abuse or neglect are dropped and unsubstantiated by judge order. If true, this means a judge reviewed the evidence that led to the boys' removal and found it unsubstantiated. The allegations that prompted DCS intervention were not proven. Does this clear Dawn and Candace of wrongdoing? Not necessarily. DCS cases have a lower burden of proof than criminal cases, but dismissals can happen for many reasons: lack of evidence, procedural issues, changed circumstances. Still, it's worth noting after 4 years of investigation, Dawn and Candace Wells have never been charged with any crime related to Summer's disappearance. They have never been charged with child abuse. They have never been arrested in connection with their daughter's case. They have been suspects in the court of public opinion, but not in a court of law. When a child disappears, the first 48 hours are critical. After that, the probability of finding the child alive drops dramatically. Everyone in law enforcement knows this. Every parent fears this. And in Summer Wells's case, those crucial first 48 hours passed with no breakthrough. But the investigation didn't stop. In fact, it intensified for 4 years now. 3 primary agencies have maintained active involvement in the search for Summer Wells: the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, serving as the lead state agency; the Federal Bureau of Investigation, providing forensic resources and federal reach; and the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, the local agency that knows the community and terrain. Together, these agencies have pursued every lead, followed every tip, and examined every possibility. And yet, Summer remains missing. Tonight, we examine what investigators have done, what they've discovered, and what they still don't know. In the days and weeks following Summer's disappearance, the TBI tip line was flooded with calls. The AY's email inbox overflowed. Law enforcement in neighboring states reported sightings. People came forward with theories, suspicions, and occasionally genuine information. By June of 2024, investigators had received more than 6,500 tips related to Summer's case. 6,500. That's an extraordinary number. To put it in perspective, most missing child cases generate a few hundred tips at most. 6,000 plus suggests a case that captured massive public attention and generated widespread speculation. But here's the challenge with tips: quantity does not equal quality. TBI Assistant Director Josh Melton addressed this issue directly. The vast majority of tips, he said, relate to rumors and social media speculation rather than first-hand information. Think about what that means. Thousands upon thousands of hours of investigative time have been spent chasing leads that originated from YouTube videos, Facebook theories, and Reddit threads. People who have never been to Hawkins County, who have never met the Wells family, who have no direct knowledge of the case, are submitting tips based on their amateur analysis of publicly available information. This is not helpful. In fact, it's actively harmful to the investigation. Melton and other TBI officials have repeatedly urged the public, submit tips only if you have direct, specific, first-hand information. Do not submit tips based on what you saw in a YouTube video. Do not submit tips based on body language analysis. Do not submit tips based on your gut feeling about the parents. The TBI has even issued public statements warning about misinformation. We've noticed an uptick in misinformation being spread online about the search for 5-year-old Summer Wells. Sheriff Lawson called this misinformation a hindrance to the investigation. A strong word that indicates real frustration with the way social media has complicated the search for Summer. But buried among those 6,500 tips, there have been a few genuinely useful leads. Investigators have pursued every credible piece of information. They've conducted nearly 170 formal interviews. They've executed multiple search warrants. They followed up on reported sightings across multiple states. And in November of 2024, one of those leads resulted in the most significant law enforcement action since the initial search. On November 13th, 2024, 3.5 years after Summer vanished, a joint operation descended on a property in the 3500 block of Vanil Road in Greenville, Tennessee. TBI agents, Hawkins County Sheriff's detectives, and FBI personnel conducted a search. This wasn't a casual follow-up. This was a coordinated, multi-agency operation, the kind of search that requires warrants, planning, and resources. Van Hill Road is approximately 9 and 12 to 10 miles from the Wells property on Ben Hill Road. It's accessed via State Route 347, still rural, still isolated, but far enough away to be significant. If Summer had wandered off, she couldn't have walked 10 miles through mountain terrain. So, if this search was related to her disappearance, and the TBI confirmed it was, it suggested investigators were following a lead that involved someone transporting Summer away from her home. TBI spokesperson Leslie Hayhart was characteristically tight-lipped about the details. She confirmed the search was related to an investigative lead in Summer's case, but she declined to provide specifics about what prompted the search, what evidence investigators were looking for, or what, if anything, they recovered. No arrests were made following the Van Hill Road search. Don and Candice Wells declined all media requests for comment after the search was announced, and the TBI returned to their standard holding statement. The investigation remains active and ongoing, with agents continuing to follow up on leads as they come in. So, what does this search tell us? First, it tells us the case is genuinely active. This was not a cold case being reviewed periodically. This was an active lead being pursued with significant resources. Second, it tells us investigators had reason to believe something connected to Summer might be found at that location. Search warrants require probable cause. A judge had to be convinced there was a reasonable basis for the search. Third, it tells us the investigation is considering scenarios beyond Summer simply wandering off and getting lost. A location 10 miles away suggests investigators are looking at human involvement, someone who transported Summer, or evidence related to her disappearance. But, without knowing what investigators found, or didn't find, we can only speculate. And speculation is exactly what the TBI has asked the public to avoid. Among the 6,500 tips, one particular lead generated significant public interest and investigative resources. In June of 2021, shortly after Summer disappeared, the TBI issued a public appeal. They were looking for information about a specific vehicle. A 1998 to 2000 maroon or red Toyota Tacoma pickup truck with a full bed leather rack and white buckets the bed. This truck had reportedly been seen near the intersection of Beach Creek Road and Ben Hill Road on June 14th or 15th, the day before or the day of Summer's disappearance. The TBI released a photo of a similar vehicle to show the public what they were looking for. The appeal went viral. Suddenly, people across Tennessee and neighboring states were reporting sightings of maroon Toyota Tacoma Omas. Hundreds of tips came in. Every red truck in the region was suddenly suspicious. Investigators followed up on the most credible sightings. But here's the problem. In rural Tennessee, pickup trucks are ubiquitous. Toyota Tacoma Omas are one of the most popular models. The description was specific enough to be useful, but common enough to generate countless false leads. And the location, Beach Creek Road and Ben Hill Road, is in an area with virtually no surveillance cameras. There are no traffic cameras. There are no businesses with parking lot cameras. This is deep rural country where privacy is a feature, not a bug. Despite hundreds of reported sightings, the driver of that red Toyota Tacoma was never identified. The truck was never captured on surveillance, and the TBI has never stated whether they confirmed the truck's presence in the area at all, or whether it was just one more unverified tip in a case full of them. But the red Toyota theory persists in public discussion because it fits a compelling narrative. The unknown person in a vehicle near the Wells property around the time of Summer's disappearance. Summer sent tracked by a dog to the road. A vehicle could explain how a child vanished without a trace. It's a theory. But without the truck, without the driver, without any corroborating evidence, it remains just that, a theory. From the beginning, investigators have pursued two primary theories about what happened to Summer Wells. Theory 1, abduction. Theory 2, Summer wandered off and became lost in the wilderness. After 4 years, the TBI maintains that both theories are equally viable. Assistant Director Josh Melton stated this explicitly in June of 2024. We don't have the evidence in this case to know for sure whether or not Summer was abducted, or whether or not she walked away from her home and became lost. If we, as investigators, speculate and focus our efforts in one direction, we're making a huge mistake. This is responsible investigative practice. Don't narrow your focus prematurely based on hunches or bias. Follow the evidence wherever it leads. But here's the maddening reality. The evidence isn't leading anywhere. Let's examine both theories and the problems with each. Theory 1. Abduction. Don and Candace Wells believe firmly, absolutely, without wavering, that Summer was abducted. Don has stated repeatedly that someone took his daughter through the woods behind the house to a waiting vehicle. From an investigative standpoint, what evidence supports this theory? The canine tracking dog that followed Summer's scent to the road is the strongest piece of evidence. If Summer's scent led to the road, it suggests she either walked there or was carried there. And if a 5-year-old reached the road, the most likely explanation for her subsequent disappearance is that she got into a vehicle willingly or unwillingly. The red Toyota sighting, if credible, could support the theory that a vehicle was in the area around the time of Summer's disappearance. The fact that exhaustive searches of 3,000 acres found no trace of Summer's body, clothing, or belongings could suggest she's not in the wilderness. She's somewhere else, taken by someone. Those are the points in favor of abduction. Now, let's consider the problems with this theory. First, there are no witnesses to an abduction. No one saw anyone on the Wells property that day except family members. No neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar vehicles. No one heard screams or sounds of struggle. Second, the timeline is incredibly tight. According to Candace's account, Summer was out of her sight for approximately 2 minutes. That's not much time for an abductor to grab a child, transport her through difficult terrain, and get to a vehicle without being seen or heard. Third, the location is isolated but visible. The Wells property is remote, yes, but it's not invisible. The camper where Candace was helping her grandmother was 20 feet from the house, with a clear line of sight. If someone had approached the house, grabbed Summer, and carried her away, wouldn't Candace or her mother have seen or heard something? Fourth, and perhaps most significant, there is no evidence of an abductor. The TBI has stated explicitly, there is no evidence that she was abducted. No unknown DNA on the property, no unfamiliar fingerprints, no cell phone pings from an unknown device in the area at the time of the disappearance. No forensic evidence that indicates a stranger was present. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Investigators know this. A skilled abductor could theoretically leave no trace. But after 4 years of intensive investigation with federal resources, the lack of any evidence pointing to an abductor is significant. So if Summer was abducted, who took her and why? This is where theories diverge into disturbing possibilities. Some speculate about human trafficking. The theory goes, rural areas are targeted by traffickers because law enforcement response times are slower and surveillance is minimal. A child could be taken quickly and transported out of state before an Amber Alert even goes out. But trafficking experts consistently push back on this narrative. Child trafficking is real and horrific, but stranger abductions for trafficking purposes are exceedingly rare. Traffickers target vulnerable children who won't be reported missing runaways, foster children, kids from deeply dysfunctional homes. Taking a child from a family who will report her missing and trigger massive law enforcement response is high risk with no clear benefit. Others speculate about a predator who had been watching the family or the area. Perhaps someone who had seen Summer before and waited for an opportunity. This is more plausible than trafficking. Predatory offenders do exist. They do target children, but again, the logistics are challenging. How would a predator know Summer would be left unsupervised for exactly 2 minutes? How would they approach the house undetected? How would they control a frightened 5-year-old without anyone hearing? A third possibility, hinted at by Dr. Phil's statement that this isn't going to be a stranger, is that someone known to the family was responsible. Perhaps someone who had access to the property, who knew the family's routines, who wouldn't seem out of place if seen in the area. This theory would explain the lack of evidence of forced entry or struggle. It would explain how someone could approach the house without raising alarm. It would explain how Summer could have been lured or convinced to leave. But if someone known to the family took Summer, investigators have not publicly identified such a person. And after 170 interviews and 4 years of investigation, you'd expect that person to have emerged as a suspect, unless that person has remained hidden in plain sight. Theory 2. lost in the wilderness. The alternative theory is simpler and in some ways more heartbreaking. Summer walked out of the house, became disoriented, and got lost in the treacherous terrain surrounding her home. 5-year-olds are impulsive. They don't understand danger. They follow their curiosity without thinking about consequences. It's entirely plausible that Summer went outside, maybe to find a toy, maybe to look for a pet, maybe just because she felt like it, and wandered into the woods. The terrain is unforgiving. Steep hills, dense vegetation, creek beds, ravines. A small child could fall, become injured, and be unable to call for help. She could become disoriented within minutes, unable to find a way back. The weather in mid-June can be hot during the day, but cool at night. Exposure, dehydration, and injury could be fatal within 24 to 48 hours. And the forest canopy is so thick in summer that aerial searches struggle to see the ground. A small body could be hidden under brush, fallen into a ravine, or concealed by natural decomposition processes. This theory is supported by the fact that many missing children in wilderness areas are never found, or are found months or years later when hunters or hikers stumble across remains miles from the last known location. But there are significant problems with this theory too. First, the timing doesn't quite fit. Summer was allegedly inside the house with her brothers when she disappeared. For the wandering theory to work, she would have had to leave the house, go outside, and head into the woods. All without her brothers noticing her leave, and without her mother seeing her exit the house from the camper. It's possible. Children move quickly. Brothers absorbed in YouTube videos might not notice their sisters slipping out, but it requires a series of fortunate circumstances for the child and unfortunate circumstances for the investigation. Second, the exhaustive search found nothing. 3,000 acres, 1,300 ground searchers, canine units, aerial surveillance, dive teams in every body of water. Yes, wilderness is vast and bodies can be hidden, but in most cases where children have wandered off and died, searchers find some evidence, a shoe, a piece of clothing, something. In Summer's case, nothing. Third, the canine tracking Summer sent to the road suggests she didn't simply wander randomly into the woods. If she had, the scent trail would have led into the forest, not to the road. Fourth, and this is anecdotal but still relevant, Summer was described by her mother as an obedient child who always answered when called. If she had wandered off and heard her mother calling, Candace called her name repeatedly and frantically, wouldn't Summer have responded? Unless she couldn't. Unless she had fallen and was unconscious. Unless she was too far away to hear. Unless she was no longer alive to respond. The truth is, the lost in wilderness theory has holes, and the abduction theory has holes. And after 4 years, investigators are still looking at both, because neither theory has produced conclusive evidence. This is what makes the Summer Wells case outside the norm. What the forensic evidence tells us and doesn't. In most criminal investigations, forensic evidence provides answers. DNA, fingerprints, digital footprints, physical evidence. These are the tools that solve cases in the modern era. But forensic evidence is only useful when it exists. In Summer's case, the forensic picture is frustratingly incomplete. TBI agents collected digital evidence from the Wells home. Cell phones, computers, tablets. They pulled phone records, examined social media accounts, reviewed text messages and emails. What did they find? We don't know. The TBI has not released any information about digital evidence. This could mean they found nothing relevant, or it could mean they found something they're keeping quiet for investigative reasons. The property searches yielded no obvious physical evidence of foul play. No blood, no signs of violence. Cadaver dogs did not alert to the presence of human remains on the property, or at least no alerts that led to discovery of evidence. The vehicles on the property were examined. No evidence of Summer being transported in any of them has been made public. There's no surveillance footage because the area has no cameras. There's no cell tower data that points to an unknown individual in the area, or at least none that has been publicly disclosed. The forensic absence is almost total. This could mean several things. It could mean Summer's disappearance was not a violent crime. If she wandered off, or if she was taken by someone who was careful and lucky, there might genuinely be no forensic evidence to find. It could mean the evidence exists but is so subtle or degraded that even intensive investigation hasn't uncovered it. Or it could mean the critical evidence is somewhere investigators haven't looked yet, on a property they haven't searched, in a vehicle they haven't examined, in a location they don't know exists. After 4 years, the investigators continue to emphasize this case is active. They are still following leads. They are still conducting interviews. They are still executing search warrants, as the November 2024 Vanille Road search demonstrated. But they are also being honest about the limitations. We don't have the evidence to know for sure what happened. It's worth stepping back to consider why this case is so difficult to solve from an investigative standpoint. Urban disappearances, while tragic, often leave trails. Surveillance cameras capture movements. Cell phones ping towers constantly. Witnesses see things. Traffic patterns can be analyzed. Digital footprints are everywhere. Rural disappearances are different. The Wells property is miles from the nearest town. There are no businesses nearby, no traffic cameras, no streetlights, no sidewalks. Cell phone reception is spotty. Internet is limited. The nearest neighbor might be a quarter-mile away, separated by dense woods. In this environment, a child can vanish and leave almost no trace. If Summer wandered off, the wilderness could have swallowed her within minutes. 3,000 acres sounds like a lot of area to search, and it is. But the Appalachian wilderness extends for thousands of square miles. If Summer walked or was carried beyond the search perimeter, she could be anywhere. If Summer was abducted, the isolation of the property worked in the abductor's favor. No cameras to capture a vehicle leaving. No witnesses to see someone carrying a child. No cell tower data to analyze because there might not have been a tower nearby. The very qualities that make rural Tennessee appealing to people who value privacy and independence, the isolation, the lack of surveillance, the distance from authority, make it incredibly difficult to investigate crimes. Investigators know this. They've adapted as best they can. But they're also being realistic. In this environment, with this lack of evidence, solving this case may require luck as much as skill. A witness who finally comes forward, a deathbed confession, a hiker stumbling across remains, a piece of information that breaks the case wide open. 4 years in, investigators are still waiting for that break. There's an investigative principle called holding back. It means keeping certain details, confidential details that only the perpetrator would know. This protects the investigation in several ways. It allows investigators to verify confessions, prevents false tips. It protects the integrity of potential prosecutions. In Summer's case, the TBI has clearly held back information. We don't know everything the brothers said in their interviews. We don't know the full details of what was found during property searches. We don't know what digital evidence was recovered. We don't know what the November 2024 Van Hill Road search was really about. This is frustrating for the public and media. We want answers. We want transparency. We want to understand what happened. But from an investigative standpoint, the TBI is doing the right thing. If they release too much information, they risk compromising the case. The challenge is that this creates information vacuum, and in that vacuum, speculation grows. People fill in the blanks with theories, assumptions, and worst-case scenarios. And once those narratives take hold in public consciousness, they become almost impossible to dislodge, even if they're completely wrong. So what do investigators actually know that they're not telling us? We can only speculate, but there are a few possibilities. They may know more about the timeline than has been released publicly. Small inconsistencies in statements that they're using to build the case, but don't want to reveal yet. They may have identified persons of interest that they're watching and investigating quietly without tipping their hand by naming them publicly. They may have forensic evidence that is ambiguous, not strong enough to charge anyone, but suggestive enough to keep them focused in a particular direction. They may know things about the family dynamic, about relationships, about histories that provide context but not proof, or they may genuinely have nothing more than what's been released, and they're protecting the investigation by keeping the public from knowing just how little they have. We don't know, and that's the point. On June 15, 2021, Summer Wells was known to perhaps a few hundred people. Her family, her neighbors, her community. A 5-year-old girl living a quiet life in rural Tennessee. By June 16th, when the Amber Alert was issued, millions of people knew her name. And by the end of that week, Summer Wells had become a social media phenomenon. True crime communities on Facebook, Reddit, YouTube, and TikTok descended on the case like digital vultures. Theories proliferated, accusations flew. Amateur sleuths, convinced they could crack the case, started analyzing every photo, every statement, every detail of the Wells family's life. The search for Summer became a spectacle, and that spectacle has both helped and hindered the investigation in ways that continue to this day. Dawn and Candace Wells have never been charged with any crime related to Summer's disappearance. They have never been named as suspects by law enforcement. They passed polygraph examinations. They have cooperated with investigators. None of that mattered to the online mob. Within weeks of Summer's disappearance, and Candace were being accused of murder on social media platforms. Facebook groups with tens of thousands of members dissected every photo of the family, every statement they made, every detail of their lives. Their criminal histories were dug up and shared widely. Dawn's felony convictions from the 1990s, his October 2020 arrest for domestic assault and weapons charges, Candace's minor misdemeanor from 2003. Their parenting was scrutinized and found wanting. Photos of the Wells property were shared with captions calling it a disgusting place to raise children. The condition of their home, cluttered, modest, clearly the home of people without much money, was cited as evidence of neglect. Body language experts on YouTube analyzed videos of Dawn and Candace, declaring them clearly guilty based on eye movements, facial expressions, and speech patterns. Never mind that body language analysis is junk science. Never mind that trauma, stress, and fear can produce behaviors that look like deception. Never mind that professional investigators with actual training and experience had examined Dawn and Candace and found their accounts credible enough to pass polygraphs. The internet had decided the parents did it. The harassment escalated beyond online comments. Dawn described people showing up at his work sites to confront him. Strangers screaming accusations in public. Someone yelled, "Baby killer," at Candace in a store. Think about that. A woman whose daughter is missing, who is either a victim of the worst tragedy a parent can experience, or is guilty of harming her child, is being accosted in public by strangers who have decided she's guilty based on YouTube videos. This is not justice. This is mob mentality, and it's one of the ugliest aspects of the true crime community's response to this case. The Wells family eventually moved to Arkansas. Don said he couldn't find work in Tennessee because he was too recognizable. People knew who he was and wouldn't hire him. Whether or not Don and Candace are guilty of anything, they deserve due process. They deserve to be presumed innocent until proven guilty. And they certainly don't deserve to be harassed by amateur internet detectives who have decided they know what happened based on watching videos and reading Facebook posts. As the case dragged on with no resolution, the online community around Summer's disappearance grew stranger and more disturbing. Psychics claimed they had visions of where Summer's body was located. Some said she was in water. Others said she was in a barn. One claimed Summer was still alive and being held in a specific house, an accusation that led to an innocent family being harassed. None of the psychic claims led to any useful information, but that didn't stop new psychics from coming forward with new visions. Conspiracy theories emerged. Some claimed Summer's disappearance was connected to human trafficking rings. Others suggested involvement of local officials or even federal agents. A few claimed the entire case was a hoax, and Summer never existed at all. These theories spread because they're compelling. They offer clear villains and simple explanations in a case that is maddeningly ambiguous. They give people a sense that they understand what happened, that they're in on a secret, that they're smarter than the authorities, but they're also completely disconnected from reality. Perhaps most disturbing were the grifters, people who exploited Summer's case for personal gain. Some YouTube creators built entire channels around the case, monetizing videos and soliciting donations from viewers who wanted to support their investigation. Some claimed they were raising money for the Wells family or for a reward fund. In some cases, this was legitimate. In others, it was fraud. The TBI explicitly warned the public about individuals exploiting Summer's case for personal gain. They cautioned people against donating to unverified fundraisers or supporting investigators who had no credentials or connection to law enforcement. A legitimate reward fund was established through the Church Hill Rescue Squad and grew to approximately $73,075. That fund was eventually transferred to the courts in June of 2022 for proper disposition. But countless other donation requests circulated online, many of them scams. This is what happens when a missing child case becomes a social media phenomenon. It attracts not just concerned citizens, but also opportunists who see a chance to make money or gain followers. Here's something we need to acknowledge. Social media is a tool. Like any tool, it can be used for good or for harm. In missing children cases, social media can be incredibly powerful for good. It spreads information quickly. It keeps cases in the public eye. It has, in some cases, directly led to children being found. The Amber Alert system, which now integrates with social media platforms, has saved lives. When millions of people see a description of a missing child in the vehicle they might be in, it creates a massive network of eyes looking for that child. In Summer's case, social media kept her story from being forgotten. 4 years later, people are still talking about Summer Wells. That sustained attention has likely contributed to the investigation remaining active rather than going cold. So, social media helped, absolutely. But it also hurt. The problem with social media in cases like this is that it democratizes investigation. But investigation shouldn't be democratic. Finding missing children and solving crimes requires expertise, training, resources, and access to information that the public doesn't have. It requires following proper procedures, maintaining chain of custody for evidence, protecting witnesses, and building cases that will hold up in court. Social media investigation has none of those things. What it has is speculation, emotion, and the confidence that comes from not actually being responsible for the outcome. When professional investigators make a mistake, a guilty person might go free, or an innocent person might be wrongly accused. When internet sleuths make a mistake, they just delete their comments and move on. The stakes are not the same. In Summer's case, social media created several specific problems. 1. It generated thousands of useless tips that wasted investigative resources. 2. It harassed and endangered the Wells family regardless of their guilt or innocence. 3. It spread misinformation that confused the public understanding of the case. 4. It created a circus atmosphere that may have discouraged legitimate witnesses from coming forward for fear of being caught up in the online mob. And 5. It turned a missing child into content, into entertainment, into something people consume over their morning coffee before moving on to the next video in their feed. That's perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. Summer Wells became content. Don and Candace Wells made a calculated decision in November of 2021, 5 months after Summer disappeared. They agreed to appear on Dr. Phil. This was by far their highest-profile media appearance. Dr. Phil's show reaches millions of viewers. For Don and Candace, it was an opportunity to tell their story, to defend themselves against the accusations, and to appeal directly to the public for help finding Summer. But it was also a risk. Dr. Phil is not a softball interviewer. His show often features confrontational exchanges. He brings in experts, body language analysts, psychologists, investigators who offer their assessments of the guests. And while Dr. Phil himself is sympathetic to victims, his show's format can be brutal. The appearance did not go smoothly for Candace. During the taping, Dr. Phil had body language experts observe Don and Candace during their interviews. The format meant Dawn and Candace were being analyzed and judged in real time. Their every gesture and expression scrutinized for signs of deception. At one point, Candace became overwhelmed. She was crying. She felt, as she later said, interrogated again. She walked off the set. This moment was broadcast to millions of viewers. And predictably, social media erupted with commentary. Some people sympathized with Candace. She was a traumatized mother being put through hell on national television. Others saw the walkout as evidence of guilt. An innocent mother wouldn't leave, they argued. She would stay and fight for her daughter. Both interpretations were speculation. The truth is, we don't know what Candace was feeling in that moment. We don't know if her emotional breakdown was the reaction of an innocent mother being falsely accused, or a guilty mother being caught in lies. We just don't know. Dr. Phil himself reached a conclusion which he stated on camera. It's clear to me that neither of you did anything to hurt your daughter. This was significant. Dr. Phil has interviewed countless parents in missing children cases. He has the expertise and experience to assess credibility. His conclusion that Don and Candace did not harm Summer carried weight, but he added a caveat. He said to Candace, "You may know more than you consciously realize." And he made a prediction. When this is solved, this isn't going to be a stranger. What did he mean? He could have meant someone in the family's extended circle was responsible. He could have meant that Candace witnessed something she didn't recognize as significant. He could have meant that the answer lies within the family's social network, rather than with a random abductor. Or he could have simply been hedging his bets, covering all possibilities while not wanting to declare the parents completely innocent. The Dr. Phil appearance did not solve the case. It did not generate new leads that broke the investigation open. What it did was expose Dawn and Candace to millions of viewers, some of whom were sympathetic, and many of whom remained convinced of their guilt. Dawn and Candace gave other interviews over the months and years following Summer's disappearance. some to local news stations, some to true crime podcasters, some to YouTube channels. In these appearances, they repeated the same core narrative. They believe Summer was abducted. They insist they had nothing to do with her disappearance. They want their daughter found. But with each interview, small inconsistencies emerged. Nothing major. The kind of minor discrepancies that are normal when people recount traumatic events multiple times over months and years. Memory is imperfect. Trauma affects recall. And being interviewed over and over is exhausting. But online sleuths seized on every tiny inconsistency as evidence of deception. Candace said Summer was wearing a pink shirt, but in another interview, someone thought she said it was a purple shirt. Proof of lies, the social media post declared. Dawn described the timeline one way in an interview, and then phrased it slightly differently in another interview. Caught in a lie, the YouTube videos proclaimed. Never mind that these are normal human variations in storytelling. Never mind that police interviews show these kinds of minor inconsistencies all the time with honest witnesses. The internet had decided every discrepancy was evidence of guilt. By 2025, Candace had largely stopped giving interviews. She told one reporter she still has nightmares and anxiety related to Summer's disappearance and the scrutiny that followed. Dawn continued to speak to media occasionally, usually around the anniversary of Summer's disappearance. His statements remained consistent. He believes Summer was taken. He wants answers. He lived with the pain of not knowing every single day. On the 4th anniversary, in June of 2025, Dawn said something that captured the heartbreak and hopelessness of his situation. I expect to see her eventually. I don't know about in this life. Whether those are the words of a grieving father or something else, we cannot say. But they reflect the reality that 4 years later, hope for Summer's safe return has faded to almost nothing. In the wake of Summer's disappearance, the community rallied. The Church Hill Rescue Squad established an official reward fund for information leading to Summer's location or the arrest of anyone responsible for her disappearance. The fund grew quickly. People donated from across Tennessee and beyond. By the time it was transferred to the courts in June of 2022, the fund held approximately $73,075. That's a substantial reward. It's the kind of money that should motivate someone with information to come forward, but no one has claimed the reward. After 4 years and more than 6,000 tips, not a single piece of information has been deemed credible enough to warrant the reward payout. What does that tell us? It could mean that no one outside the immediate situation knows what happened to Summer. If she wandered off and died in the wilderness, there would be no information to reward. If she was taken by someone who has told no one, there would be no informant to come forward. The investigation into Summer Wells' disappearance has been a relentless search for answers. But 4 years later, it remains one of Tennessee's most perplexing and heartbreaking mysteries. As the case drags on, the public's interest and speculation have only intensified, with social media playing a significant role. The circulation of theories, accusations, and amateur investigations has made the case even more complicated. What was once a community's desire for answers has become a circus of opinions and accusations, leading to frustration and confusion. Despite the efforts of law enforcement, including the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, and the Hawkins County Sheriff's Office, investigators are still no closer to solving the case than they were on June 15, 2021, when Summer disappeared. The pressure to solve the case weighs heavily on those working tirelessly behind the scenes, but the obstacles they face are staggering. One of the most significant challenges in this case is the lack of physical evidence. In criminal investigations, physical evidence, DNA, fingerprints, fibers, digital footprints, provides critical clues. Without it, the investigation becomes a guessing game. Despite multiple searches of the Wells property, including 11 documented searches by TBI agents, nothing definitive was found. No blood, no signs of a struggle, no traces of Summer's clothing. The cadaver dogs, capable of detecting even trace amounts of human decomposition, failed to alert to any remains on the property. This lack of physical evidence forces investigators to rely on other tools: witness testimony, digital records, and expert analysis. However, in Summer's case, the timeline is frustratingly vague. The official account from Candace Bly, Summer's mother, is the only version of events. According to Candace, Summer was last seen walking into the house after being outside planting flowers. She then went inside to visit her brothers, but when Candace returned a short time later, Summer was gone. The problem lies in the time frame. A 2-minute window, according to Candace's recollection, is all investigators have to work with. But memories can be unreliable, and without surveillance footage or any other form of verification, it's impossible to know exactly when Summer disappeared, or what happened in those critical moments. Adding to the complexity, Summer's brothers, the only other witnesses, were distracted and watching YouTube videos at the time. Their testimony has been inconsistent, and their young age at the time of the incident adds another layer of uncertainty. Their statements were crucial, but without any corroborating evidence, they provide limited information. Another complication in the investigation is the lack of independent witnesses. There were no neighbors who saw anything unusual that day. No one heard screams, saw a strange vehicle, or noticed a child being carried off the property. The Wells property is located in a rural area, which means that it was isolated and away from the eyes of potential witnesses. Even in the digital age, where phones and social media leave traces, investigators faced additional barriers. The Wells property had spotty cell service, which limited the ability to track phone movements. There were no surveillance cameras on the property or in the surrounding areas. The lack of these digital breadcrumbs makes the case much harder to solve, as investigators rely on such evidence in the modern world. Further complicating matters is the lack of any significant findings in the family's digital communications. The TBI obtained warrants and searched through the Wells devices, including phones, computers, and tablets. However, the results of these searches have not been made public. Whether nothing significant was found, or if something is being kept confidential for investigative reasons, is unclear. But the lack of transparency only adds to the mystery surrounding the case. In missing children investigations, the most important tool is often physical evidence. DNA, fingerprints, and other trace evidence can link a suspect to a crime. But without these pieces, investigators are left to piece together a puzzle with only a few pieces to start. In Summer's case, DNA and fingerprint evidence have been minimal or non-existent. There are no physical markers of her presence or abduction, and even cadaver dogs have not picked up any sense of human remains. Forensic science is vital, but it has its limits. Without biological material to test, there is no way to perform DNA analysis. In cases where there's no sign of a struggle or violence, it's nearly impossible to prove that a crime occurred. Even with sophisticated forensic tools, investigators can only work with what they have, and in Summer's case, the evidence is too sparse. The most promising leads might come from someone with information, someone who knows what happened and has remained silent. However, despite the $73,000 reward, no one has come forward with concrete information. This leaves investigators with a frustrating dead end. The reward is still unclaimed, and it raises questions about why no one has come forward. Could someone know what happened but be too afraid to speak? Or is it possible that the case is even more complex than anyone realizes, with people too close to the situation to reveal what they know? When looking at other high-profile missing children cases, many were solved quickly because there was clear evidence. Elizabeth Smart was found because of a witness's testimony. J.C. Dugard was rescued after 18 years in captivity due to a witness who remembered something suspicious. But in Summer's case, there are no such witnesses, no clear signs of an abduction, and no physical evidence that points to a suspect. Other missing children cases like Madeleine McCann or Asher Degree share similarities with Summer's case in that they disappeared from secure locations with family nearby. But no one knows what happened. The toll this case has taken on everyone involved, especially the investigators, has been immense. As TBI Assistant Director Josh Melton said, "When I see the picture of Summer Wells, I see my daughter." This statement reveals the deep emotional toll this case has taken on law enforcement, many of whom are parents themselves. The frustration of not having answers, not being able to give closure to the family, weighs heavily on them. As difficult as it is, the case has to be managed with practical reality in mind. Investigators have limited resources, and after 4 years, the investigation has shifted to a more strategic approach. Tips are still being followed up on, and the case is being periodically reviewed. However, without new evidence, the investigation is not as active as it once was. Investigators are waiting for a breakthrough, whether it comes from someone coming forward with information or from new evidence or forensic techniques. The hope is that someday, somehow, the case will be solved. But 4 years later, the chances of Summer being found alive are slim. The probability of a child surviving 4 years of captivity is low. However, the search for Summer Wells is still ongoing, and the investigation remains open. In December 2025, Summer's Amber Alert remains active, a rare occurrence in a case that has dragged on for so long. It's the longest-running Amber Alert in Tennessee history, and the hope is that someone will come forward with information that will finally solve the case. Age progression images of Summer at 7 and 9 years old have been released, showing what she might look like if she's still alive. These images are valuable for identification purposes, but as more time passes, the likelihood of finding her alive decreases. As for her family, Don and Candace Wells have relocated to Arkansas in search of a fresh start, away from the media spotlight and the scrutiny of their own community. Don has occasionally spoken to reporters, maintaining his belief that Summer was abducted. Candace has largely disappeared from public view, her life fractured by the ongoing trauma of losing her daughter and the accusations leveled against her. The three boys, who were initially in state care after Summer's disappearance, were eventually placed in foster care, and Don and Candace's parental rights were signed over in 2024. The investigation remains open, but what can still be done? What will it take to solve Summer's case? Possibilities remain, but they are limited. The most realistic outcome may be the discovery of remains, new forensic techniques, or someone coming forward with critical information. Without these breakthroughs, however, the case may remain one of those permanent mysteries. Unsolved and unresolved, Summer Wells deserves to be found. She deserves justice. Her family deserves answers, and justice deserves to be served. The investigation may have slowed, but the hope for answers remains. As Don Wells said, "I expect to see her eventually. I don't know about in this life." And maybe, just maybe, someone will come forward with the answers that have been so elusive for so long.